Brothers and sisters in Christ, it is time. It is time. And we, your Ebony bishops, are here to provide leadership for such a time as this. One of the things that Bishop Beard said last night was that he appreciated the opportunity to be able to worship in his own tradition. A truer word ain't never been said. And it also is gratifying to experience the ways in which the Black church honors its Episcopal leaders. It is gratifying that you come to us asking us for leadership. It is gratifying that you come to us and say, bishops, speak a word from the Lord, because you have an expectation, a belief that a word from the Lord will come from your Ebony bishops. We appreciate the Black church and how you honor your Ebony bishops. And so we're here this morning to share a word about some administrative matters, some spiritual matters, and some pastoral matters. We've been asked by the leadership of BMCR to specifically deal with 3 buckets of issues. We've been asked to deal with the bucket of issue around the gathering that happened in Chicago with some leaders of some of the traditionally African-American organizations and groups and caucuses in our church. We've been asked to unpack the bucket of the protocol for reconciliation and grace through separation. And after our sister taught us this morning that reconciliation takes on a new meaning. And last, we've been asked to deal with a bucket of providing some prophetic word for the Black church for such a time as this. And so I've asked particular bishops to speak directly to some of those issues, but all of us are going to have the opportunity to speak into them. I'm going to ask that Bishop Malone start by sharing with you all something about the vision of the event in Chicago that was hosted by the Ebony bishops, because originally God gave her the vision. She wrote it and made it plain, and we decided to follow along with that vision that God had given her. So Bishop Malone, won't you talk with us?
Good morning. Peace and love be with each and every one of you as we begin this time of conversation and engagement. We are aware that there have been conversations happening all across the church. And these conversations really began happening even prior to General Conference 2019. Many of the conversations, knowing that some of the legislation that was coming before the General Conference 2019 was leading to the possibility even then of dissolution and separation of the United Methodist Church. And there was great concern that the Black constituency of the church, lay and clergy, were not in places where decisions were being made, not just about the future of the United Methodist Church, but also about the role and the place of the Black church in the midst of that. So there was great concern. And within the Council of Bishops, the Ebony bishops, we gather regularly at every meeting, and we were having our own conversations. And what we were discerning was that there was really no unifying voice or unifying effort to bring all of those conversations together as it related to Black people. So we committed ourselves to do some deep listening, to be in places where we would normally be, places like the Convocation of Black Pastors, places like National BMCR, places like National Black Clergy Women Gatherings. So we committed that we would reach out to all of the leaders of those particular groups and extend the invitation that while some of us Ebony bishops would be in those gatherings, that we would create some intentional space for some conversation. And that did happen. At the convocation for Black pastors in January of 2019, the Ebony bishops who were present, we gathered with the leaders of the convocation. And we had some good conversation about some of our concerns, some of our hopes, some of our dreams, some of our anxieties, but nothing like really tangible or specific came out of that, but it was a good conversation. It was a good place to start. And then, of course, a number of us Ebony bishops, we attended the National BMCR of the 2019 gathering, and the same thing took place. We had some intentional conversation. A number of us sat on a panel just like this, and we began to respond to questions and concerns and fears from those who were attending BMCR. And then a number of us Ebony bishops, we also attended the Black Clergy Women's Gathering. And the same thing happened. There were conversations taking place and a lot of questions being asked. And what I discerned, having been in all of those conversations, was that while we were all asking the same questions and sharing the same concerns and stating the same fears and frustrations, how do we begin to bridge and get us all in the same conversation to see if we can come to some sense of common ground and some sense of common strategy, knowing that we are not a monolithic people? And so out of those conversations, I basically just submitted a proposal to the Ebony bishops, and that was for us to have an event where we would invite leaders of all of our Black constituencies. Sometimes when we think about who we are as Black United Methodists, we think of Convocation of Black Pastors, we think of BMCR, we think of SBC 21, we think about the Black clergy women, but there are other Black constituencies within the Black church. So we extended an invitation, the Ebony bishops extended an invitation to SBC 21, BMCR, G-Corps, Black clergy women, Gammon, Black colleges, all of our Black general secretaries, leaders of the Convocation of Black Pastors, Gulfside Association, African American Heritage Center. We sent a letter out to all of our Black constituencies, and we did not decide who should be in the room. The invitation said the Ebony bishops would like to be able to create an intentional space where we can all gather and gather up the concerns that we have so we can have a collective voice and a collective wisdom, so we can see if something could emerge from that gathering that will set us forth on a path that we can speak into this chaos within the church to make sure that our perspective, our needs, that our future for the Black church is being addressed not from the majority, but that we speak our own truth and our own wants and our own needs. We invited each of those entities to send to this gathering 3 to 4 persons that would represent, that would bring that voice and that perspective. There were about 50 people who gathered, and those bodies did respond, and they made those decisions as to who they would send. We were very fortunate that we did not do this work alone. While we were the visionary behind it and we were the leaders to facilitate it, we partnered with G-Corps. And G-Corps helped to fund it. Some of the funding came from the Ebony Bishops Fund, but also some of the funding came from G-Corps to make it possible and accessible for persons to travel, to have lodging, to have meals, to be in one conversation. We also were very intentional that when we looked at the Black constituencies and who the persons were that were coming, we also recognized that there were some other perspectives not being represented. So those of us who were planning and designing what this day would look like, we then said, let's make sure that we get some of our younger adults in the conversation, lay and clergy. And then we looked across the church to make sure that somebody from every jurisdiction was represented in that conversation beyond those persons that were being sent from the Black constituencies. We gathered for 2 days in Chicago. And I will tell you, it was a very meaningful conversation, some truth-telling, some reality check. And we heard from some of the makers and the writers of some of the legislation, of what was forthcoming, for them to be able to put that before us to see, can we get around any of this together? You know, can we come out of here with some sense of agreement of, you know, what path might we be able to take together, even though we know that we're all in different places, but as it relates to the Black church, can we have at least a common agenda? And I will say to you that there were a number of things that came out of that meeting. First and foremost, what came out of it was that we need to be very mindful of what legislation is coming forth that will impact the Black church. And that we need not wait, but we need to get ahead of it so we can do the kind of teaching and training for our General Conference delegates to make sure that any legislation that will have any impact on the Black church, that people are informed and ready to respond on our behalf. Another thing that came out of the conversation was that no matter what happens in May 2020, and there will be the United Methodist Church, but the concerns and the needs and the issues that's facing the Black church will still be the same issues and needs facing the Black church. That May is not going to fix it. That we need to be committed to greater discipleship and witness, and we need to have a plan and a strategy for that to happen. So that was named, and there was some conversation around that. Another thing that came out was that we need to let go of some of our holdings of some of our buildings and properties and ministries that we know that are dead, and begin to rethink and reimagine and repurpose for greater witness and discipleship. So what happened was, from all of those table conversations and presentations, we began to map some of this work on a board. And then we began to have people who were there present to say who would be willing to begin to even work on some of this, who would take responsibility for some of this. The reality is, some of the work that emerged from that really belongs to SBC 21. That's the work of SBC 21. But we also knew that SBC 21 would be in a state of transition because our national executive director at that time had already submitted his retirement. But we did not want this good work to get lost. So by the grace of God, G-Corps, Aaron Hawkins, and I need to send a shout out to Aaron Hawkins because she was very instrumental in working with us to help us secure our facilitator, who was Garlinda Burton, who did a phenomenal job. Having that kind of high capacity leaders in one place, she did a phenomenal job. And so Aaron, what she has done, she has taken all of that work back to G-Corps, and they've already begun to have Zoom calls trying to work a strategy and a plan for how do we create some momentum around each of these different ideas. So she has given me an update that 2 of the teams have already begun working. And there's already some training and preparation being done for persons of color, delegates to General Conference, around all of the legislation that will have any impact on the Black church and other people of color. Okay? So there's some training and some tracking of all of that. That work is already underway. There's also a plan underway now that we have our newly named National Executive Director for SBC 21, that some of the other work that really belongs in that portfolio, that there's going to be an intentional conversation between Aaron and Reverend Dr. Michael Bowie so that work can get transferred, because we don't want it to get lost. Keep in mind, we knew that when we planned this gathering that there were already conversations being had. Our sole goal as your bishops was to try to bridge all of these conversations, because they were happening in all different places. So we said, how do we come together to bridge the conversations so that we can build deeper relationships with each other, so that we can begin to even trust each other more, that we can be able to identify in a clear and consistent way what are our concerns, our issues, our fears, our hopes, our dreams, what are our expectations, And then what can be some common strategies that we can begin to develop to help shape the future of the Black church. So that's how that event evolved. That's where the vision came from. That is the why it was necessary for it to happen. That's how the persons who were invited while they were in the room. And I want to say thank you on behalf of the Ebony Bishops. Thank you for your willingness to engage in such conversation, and for those entities, those constituencies of the Black church, for your response, for making sure that you and those who are part of that important work were part of that conversation. So that work is ongoing.
Thank you, Bishop Malone, thank you. Are there any other bishops on our panel who want to add information to what Bishop Malone just presented? If not, beloved, this is how we're going to move forward. At this point, we will take 3 questions. 3 questions regarding the event in Chicago. We don't, at this point, want to hear your opinion about it or preaching regarding it. At this point, we would like to entertain questions that you might have about it. Yes, sir.
Mark Harrison with the General Board of Church and Society. Tracy, you used the word bridge. What is the bridge that's taking place with African bishops? And why were they not at least a representative, someone from Africa, to hear the dialogue and the discussions that are taking place?
I appreciate you raising that question, and that was one of the questions that did come up in the room. And as a matter of fact, I'm looking at even some of my notes from here. There was a commitment that was named that there's going to be a more intentional effort for us U.S. Black people to connect with the Black diaspora, our other Black people across the world, and particularly Africa. And so that did come up in our conversation. That was named as a concern, but also as an opportunity. And that was about the bridging too, that we need to be more intentional about building relationships, not just when it's time to vote on legislation, but intentional relationships. And I would like to say this, that the Black clergy women, particularly the Sacred Sisters, that was born out of the Northern Illinois Conference. There was a conference that took place just last year at Africa University with Black clergy women, not just from Northern Illinois. The Sacred Sisters organization is part of the North Central jurisdiction, but invited other Black clergy women from across the church who traveled to Zimbabwe for that purpose, to begin some of those intentional grassroots efforts to build relationships. Not just when it's time for General Conference, but that we need to build intentional relationships. That was named.
I'd also like to just speak to this for just a moment. And I hope you can hear the spirit in which what I'm about to offer is given. On the Council of Bishops, right, we have an Ebony Bishops caucus, a group, and we meet at times. And there are times that our African brothers and sisters are included in that conversation, but then there are also times when we all understand that there are some things germane to our particular contexts that also need to be discussed. And so when our African bishops gather, and they gather to discuss things that are pertinent for them, we don't feel excluded because they may not invite us to that particular gathering, nor does that mean that there's never any time that they invite us. The same is true when Black bishops from the United States gather and have conversation germane to some of the challenges, needs that are before us, and our African bishops do not feel left out or excluded because they respect that. The same can be true for work beyond the Council of Bishops. So because a meeting happens and everybody may not be in that meeting, I hope we don't always look at that as exclusion, There are times when we will gather in plenary, and there are times that we will gather in smaller groups, but it doesn't always have to be seen as exclusionary. Sometimes it's simply that there's work that needs to be done in those smaller groups that is more germane to their context and their work, but not to the permanent exclusion of those bodies coming together to do work that is pertinent to the whole, to the larger diaspora.
Do my brothers have anything they'd like to add? All right, all right. There, we've got a question in the back, and then this one right here. Those will be our three on this topic.
Good morning, thank you. Quick question, wanted to know how the work of the deacon can support the efforts and how to get involved, if there are any opportunities to get involved.
Thank you, my sister, for lifting our deacons.
While we were at the gathering in September of last year, it was named that the good work that was done in that room is only as good as it trickles down and become a grassroots effort. That was named and that was expected, that those different entities who were in that room, I'm not sure how many of you saw the press release that came after the gathering. There was a press release that pretty much laid out what came out of that gathering. So I want to make you aware of that is out there. And even as part of that press release, the expectation was, again, the purpose of the event was to bridge. The expectation was that for those who attended those different entities, that you would go back to your respective entities and begin to share and report out and involve and engage more people around those particular areas. Case in point, here at BMCR right now, BMCR was there in the room. Even having this conversation right now to find out what happened in the room is part of the information to say, how do I get involved? Now, I don't have a specific answer to that, but what I'm saying is those are the kind of questions and the kind of discussion that needs to happen to say, yes, how do we engage more people in this? What would be some of those strategies? That's the work of BMCR. Same thing with SBC 21. SBC 21 was in the room. Okay, so how do we inform our constituencies? How do we encourage, right? And how do we empower people to get involved, to become more engaged around some of the work that came out of that? So the event itself could not produce that, but what the event did was to allow for the different ideas and strategies to emerge, and then the work needs to go back to those particular places to begin to flesh it out. But I am thankful to hear our sister, who is a deacon in the United Methodist Church, asking the question, and my hope is that there is some space provided where we can think about some strategies of how to do that. That is the work of what we do when we gather. How do we do that? That's our work.
Thank you. Thank you. Bishop Trimble.
I want to say thank you to the good doctor who just spoke, who's also a police officer and a chaplain. And I would like to say that deacons is an unclaimed blessing of the black church. And I think we ought to, I'm saying this as an appeal and an invitation to the executive committee of BMCR to include that in future conversations. When we talk about revitalizing our local caucuses of BMCR, we talk about revitalizing the church. I think deacons is an unclaimed blessing. I'm making an appeal to my friend, the president of Gammon and other places. I think we really need to promote the order of deacons more so. You can probably count African-American deacons on two hands across the church. And and I know the predecessor to the office of deacon and so forth, but I think this is an opportunity gap that we could take advantage of in terms, everybody is not called to be an elder, everybody's not called to do different things, but I think the calling and the order of deacons, and particularly having more representation from the African and African-American community in the order of deacons, would be a blessing for the present and for the future.
Amen. Amen. And as the natural bridge builders, our deacons can certainly help us to figure this out. Amen. Our last question on this topic.
Good morning. I am Reverend Dr. K. Llewellyn McGee, a chaplain, lieutenant colonel, retired from the U.S. Army. St. Paul is where I got my master's and my doctorate. My question this morning is dealing with where are people from ministries beyond the local church engaged in this fight? Those who are in that ministry may not be in a traditional church as a pastor. And then where are some of our military input to this, who may be serving across the country and really across the world?
If there's somebody here who wants to respond, I have a response.
I do not know how they were specifically involved in the event that Bishop Malone outlined so fantastically. I would point out that she indicated that they kept looking around and continue to look around, and I know SBC 21 and others will pick this up for who is missing in the conversation. So that's already been stated. I want to reiterate it because there are no perfect gatherings and perfect events. Right now, as I look out here, there's some constituency among Ebony people that are not here for whatever reasons. So that's not always, and you haven't said this, Brother Chaplain, it's not, we got to avoid conspiracy theories that someone was intentionally excluded, which is not what you said. I'm throwing that in. But here's what I want to say about folks in extension ministry and engagement in the African American church. And this would be true in the larger church, that sometimes, as I think our brother is more than intimating, we lose sight of the rich resource of the clergy who are in extension ministry. And they become not persona non grata, we just lose track of them in terms of their engagement in the annual conference, especially if they are not exercising their ministry in the life within the bounds of the annual conference. There are many exceptions to that, and I do believe that bishops, cabinets, boards of ordained ministry, et cetera, in the annual conference structure need to be more focused and intentional about seeing all the people, so to speak, and seeing all of the resources that we have, because it is rich. So, for example, in this current crisis, let's say, around the coronavirus, it was my privilege to reach out to multiple clergy who are on the staff of the system in our area called Ohio Health, of which the annual conference is the sole member. And I got all the resourcing that I needed for the annual conference, for our conference staff, for our conference center, et cetera. And they were responsive because their bishop called them and said, look, I need you to resource us over here so people won't go crazy in the conference office thinking they're going to drop dead any minute. And so that's a simple example. But let me flip the script and then I'll bring it to a hasty conclusion. Keep in mind, extension ministry, the root of that terminology is to extend the ministry of the local church. So a flip side of that is, how deeply engaged are clergy in extension ministry appointments in a local church? Because that's different than saying, I'm here to resource you as an expert, of which we need that expertise, whether it's coming from chaplaincy, from the therapeutic community, et cetera. But we also need those clergy to find a place in a local church where they can work out their soul salvation with fear and trembling and pour in to a congregation. Because at the end of the day, I still believe that it is communities of faith, local congregations, or whatever iteration they take, whether fresh expressions, that have the most ongoing effect, with some exceptions, on forming people into the likeness of Jesus Christ.
Amen. Amen. All right, bishops, you all get the last word. We're getting ready to move to our next subject, but if you have anything else you want to add regarding the Chicago gathering, this would be the time. Yes.
The one thing that stood out to me in the Chicago gathering was just the rich diversity that we have amongst ourselves. There was not a one-size-fits-all, and we were represented across every spectrum of ideology and theology. And I think that made for a very good gathering, and I appreciated that.
And as we had conversation, we treated each other with respect and love, and we had the expectation that God was working through each and every person who was there, irrespective of their theological perspective. We were role models, I believe, for the United Methodist Church. Amen? Amen. And I want to congratulate those who asked questions, because you were role models as to how to ask a question. Amen. Amen. All right, we're now going to call on Bishop Latrell Easterling to provide us a backdrop to the protocol. She was one of the bishops who represented the Council of Bishops in that mediation process.
Thank you, Bishop Moore-Kokoy. So, beloved, we know that as we exited General Conference in 2019, we were a heavy denomination. There was pain on all sides. I hate to even use the term sides, but that is sort of like the truncated language that we use. But in every aspect of Methodism, every corner of the globe where Methodist persons are planted, there was pain. And it was Bishop Yambasu who said that the Spirit would not let him rest until he did something to speak to the pain, and he felt the deep divisions that came with us out of that special session of General Conference in St. Louis. And so through his deep prayer and discernment, he called together a group of persons to have some initial conversation on what might we do for this beloved denomination to move forward in a different way, to move forward in a way that might help us move beyond the divisions that have plagued us since 1972. What might we do to lift this from simply continuing to be a floor fight at General Conference? Might there be a way that we can convene and gather and have productive and respectful conversation that would help our denomination to be able to move forward? They had an initial gathering, and they determined that the way that this conversation should proceed would be to try to bring together representatives from the various theological streams. And we know there are many ways that there's a lot of terminology that we might use, but the terminology they settled on was to try and make sure that there were representatives from progressives, traditionalists, and centrists, but also to be intentional about making sure that it was a global conversation and not just a United States conversation. And then they determined that they needed to find someone who would be able to mediate the conversation, because as you know, when you begin to get more than about 3 persons together in a room, it's hard to be able to be strategic with the time, right? Making sure that everyone has a chance to be heard, that there is well-reasoned, disciplined conversation. So then they began to look for a mediator to help guide the conversation. Ken Feinberg was identified, and as he was introduced to the conversation, he actually said that in his deep breath of mediation work, and you've seen his vitae, I'm not going to go through that with you here today. He's done this work across the world, that if you gather more than about 15 persons, the conversation becomes untenable. And so that was his wisdom, discernment, and experience that helped to arrive at a number, but yet real intentionality went into, of that number, how much representation can we have to try to make sure? Now, you just heard my esteemed colleagues say there's never a perfect gathering. There's never a time when absolutely every voice that wants to be in the room might be there. But again, great care was taken to try and make sure that constituencies across this conversation were present. Now, in good Methodist fashion, we pushed back. There was a little pushback and said, okay, can we just have one more? And so the number grew from 15 to 16. But that was the final number of persons gathered to then. Now, understand, some of the persons that were in that initial conversation that Bishop Yambasu did not become those that populated the group of 16 that carried this work forward. Decisions were made as to who might be some of the best stakeholders to be in that work moving forward. But the 16 were amassed, and meetings were held at the law firm of Kirkland and Ellis in Washington, D.C., looking at how can we move forward in a way that allows the United Methodist Church to remain, but also respects that we finally have to admit that there are, unfortunately, some irreconcilable differences among us, and that we cannot continue together in a way that allows us to move away from this issue. I don't want to say back to our work, because this is part of our work, but how might it not be the matter that dominates all of our coming together in our global legislative body, which is General Conference? We all know that the WCA had already been meeting, had been meeting for some time, had already designed their new book of discipline, had already begun to put the framework together on how they might move forward at whatever time they decided that they wanted to call persons into joining their new stream of Methodism. That work was well underway. And so persons who represented that body at this meeting said, we believe that it is time for us to separate. I want us to really understand that nomenclature. Separate. No one was forced out. No one was told, you lost, therefore you should leave. It was a separation, blessing and sending, rather than continue fighting and rending. And that was the language that we kept before us. How can this be, right? How can this be the vision that helps us to negotiate our way into these new streams of Methodism across, again, our theological differences? And so we began in earnest to do that mediating work. As you're well aware, anytime that you enter into a mediation, you're going to lay on the table the things that you, whether you call them the deal breakers, whether you call them the lines in the sand, you put them on the table so that your foremost interests are made known. And then a good mediator is going to look at those and say, all right, you say that those are your lines in the sand, you say those are your deal breakers, but are they really the constitutive issues that you really need to, I'm going to fall on this sword? Or might we be able to do some work even around those? And that's where Ken Feinberg was masterful. And he really pressed upon us. We would sometimes divide into, again, our caucus groups, I'll use that term, and have some privileged and private conversation. He really pushed us to say, is that really a deal breaker? Or might there be more flexibility, more nimbleness around that issue than you've been willing to concede? And all parties at the table had to engage in that. And so we began to see where we could respectfully be willing to say, all right, I can offer some compromise on this. I've spoken to some of the constituents that I represent here. I can offer some compromise on that. And that's how we were able to remain at table. It was a process that we have not been able to find a way to have in our General Conference legislative processes. but it allowed us to remain at that table when there were certainly times that different ones of us at different points said, I think I'm going to have to leave the room. I think I'm going to have to leave. I don't think I'll come back. But we kept coming back. We kept coming back. So understand that there was some give and take on all sides of this discussion. Persons that were in the room, as I've just alluded to, were having conversations with some of the constituencies that they represented. I know that there's questions around, well, why wasn't this group at the table, or again, that group at the table? Again, understanding that the mediator asked us to respect his wisdom around that number, but then the conversation was able to extend and expand because persons were having conversations with other persons in their spheres of influence, and these, again, larger groups, constituencies, progressive, traditionalist, centrist. And so there was some weighing in of larger bodies of persons in bringing, that were brought back and helped to inform the conversation and the negotiation that we were having at the table. I know that there's been some question about, well, why don't we see coming out of the protocol, and then therefore the corresponding legislation, matters that are pertinent to the life of some of the bodies that will remain, we believe, we hope and pray, within the United Methodist Church as we understand it moving forward. The analogy that I've used with respect to that, beloved, is anytime there is a relationship, and that relationship, you've arrived at the point where you must confess that you have irreconcilable differences. I don't care whether that's a marriage, whether that's a business partnership, or even a judicatory relationship such as the United Methodist Church. You do not sit down with those persons and say, now, after we separate and go our separate ways, let us now draw out how we're going to live our lives once we've separated, and you sign off on how I'm going to live my life, and I'll sign off on how you're going to live your life, right? You don't do that. You negotiate the assets that are attendant to the separation. You divide those in a way that you believe is appropriate, looking at all of the factors surrounding that. You draw up, right, your document of separation, and then when you begin your new life in your separated, right, entity, then you begin to say, now here's how I'm going to order my life, or those who want to join me, here's how we're going to order our lives moving forward. And so we believe that there were simply some matters that, quite frankly, those who will separate don't have any business weighing in on how we will move forward as the United Methodist Church, nor do we have any business weighing in on how they should live their new life and form their new life together. And so that's why you don't see everything contained in the protocol. But now I'll speak for Latrell Miller Easterling. When the United Methodist Church is formed after this separation, that is when every group, every constituency, every interest group, everybody, as my sister said yesterday, needs to rise up and say, now is the time for our voices to be heard. Now, we don't care how long or how wide or how broad that table needs to be. We need to make sure that everybody is there so that as this new entity is birthed, we do not continue any of the mistakes, any of the deficiencies, any of the sin that occurred with the prior denomination. How will power be dealt with in this new entity? How will we learn from the racism and the sexism and the ableism and the homophobia? How will we learn from the ills that plagued us in our former judicatory? That is when I hope BMCR, SBC 21, all of our caucuses in some of our regional areas, that is when I hope, if you have to storm the stage, at General Conference, I hope that is when you will say, we will not move forward until we are assured that the priorities of this new denomination include our priorities. That's where I believe this hardcore press that I feel sometimes around questioning the protocol, that's when that will be most appropriate, because it will be key in that new formation, right? That everybody is included, and that there is no work that is seen as secondary, or we'll get to it as an afterthought. Yeah, y'all just stay in the back because we're going to get no, 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 no. Because then we will simply be modeling that which has gotten us to where, a part of where we are today. Now that was, okay, that was Latrell Miller Easterling. Let me come back to the protocol. And so, I see my sister. All right. Give me just a few more. Yeah, as I come to a close. Answer those questions. I will. As I come to a close. The $39 million. I just want you to understand that this is the first time in the life of this denomination that the concerns and the interest of the Black church were central. And that is where this conversation about you will set aside monies to ensure that, again, as this new denomination is birthed, that these concerns, these groups that do phenomenal work, but do ministry, not, again, adjunct work, but core ministry, that they are funded and they will be able to continue on in the ensuing years. And so the $39 million represents almost dollar for dollar what had been apportioned to these groups moving forward. So we wanted to make sure that for several quadrennia moving forward, those monies are present. Beloved, hear this. That is a floor, not a ceiling. It's a floor and not a ceiling. It does not mean that other monies cannot be requested. It does not mean that other monies will not be given. It doesn't mean that. So again, understand, it was though to ensure that that wasn't lost, right? We always say follow the money. So we wanted to make sure that the $39 million was there as the transition in the denomination moves forward. With respect to what will happen at General Conference if the protocol passes, there are, the General Commission on General Conference is working on the sequencing of items for General Conference, and there are there's legislative work being done to try to bring the protocol early into that gathering, because if, of course, as you can imagine, if the protocol passes, that will then change how we need to order our business moving forward. And so do understand that there's a good task force team that has been formed to look at what will happen with the sequencing. I can't tell you exactly what that is right now because it's too fluid. The process is still too fluid, and we don't know how the protocol, in what shape will it actually be passed, what amendments will there be made. But do know that there is intentional and strategic work going into how do we order our business at General Conference if the protocol passes. In terms of next steps, there's also great wisdom that's being given to how do we make sure that the actions that are taken can withstand constitutional muster. And so there's some things that we originally, when the 16 were sitting with Ken Feinberg and his colleagues, we sort of dreamed that we would be able to move in rapid succession, pass the protocol legislation, move into regional bodies, pass that legislation, be able to immediately remove the language of the traditional plan, be able to remove the language of the restrictive language in the Book of Discipline. These were sort of our dreams, but we had to be brought back into some constitutional reality. The worst thing we could do is to move some things forward only to have them completely unraveled by the Judicial Council. And so, again, the mediation team continues to be in conversation and dialogue about how do we move this forward in a way that can withstand constitutional muster and really help us, again, to form this United Methodist Church in a way that will allow us not to have to keep coming back to revisit this and then to really disappoint one another in thinking that we have made a historic and monumental change only through legal maneuverings to be brought back to square one. So those things are being addressed even as we speak.
Thank you, my sister.
Thank
Amen. Amen. In just a moment, I'm going to ask Bishop Palmer to share some of his experiences working with the protocol. He also represented the council. But before I ask him to share, let me say this. Bishop Easterling talked about the moment in time that will present itself when we need to insert ourselves in the reconciliation of the United Methodist Church. If you this morning missed Reverend, and I'm going to claim it, Dr. Yvette Massey's Bible study, you missed a theological and biblical mandate as to how we make that reconciliation happen through BMCR. So ask someone who was there this morning what she said, and make sure that 8 a.m. tomorrow morning you are here to hear more of what God is going to say through her. Amen? Amen. We miss out. We miss out if we sleep in. The early bird catches the word. Amen? Amen. All right, Bishop Palmer.
Bishop Moore Kokoi, just sort of picking up responsively. Okay, great. I want to thank Bishop Easterling for that. In one sense, it may be hard for some of you to imagine how much content she compressed into a very short presentation. But hey, give her some love. Give her some love. Yeah. And I want to say all of the streams of her preparation really came together in that moment. So thank you very much, Bishop Easterling. A couple of thoughts. If you are able to remember, and I know it's being recorded, the outline or summary she's given you, there are some, obviously you can read the protocol. There's a PowerPoint presentation that members of the team have posted, and that will help you to bring that outline bring it to mind to help you kind of live more into the protocol. And I think she has aptly and ably indicated that, and I tried to say this earlier about another matter, that there are imperfections when you bring groups together. And I'm not looking for a pass. I wasn't the main driver of this thing. It's just that I accept the imperfectness of the human enterprise, but I don't want to dumb down on the aspiration to move toward perfection. So let me be very clear. But I accept that the foibles that happen in our people work. So a couple of thoughts. It was a privilege to be a part of it. It was difficult to say yes to being a part of it. It was painful at many moments because I've been a person who's been all in previously in the Methodist Church, and while I never served as a clergy person just because of age, I have very distinct memories of the central jurisdiction. And so having been, as others in this room, a little kid when the Delaware Annual Conference would convene at Tinley Temple Church, and by the way, it would be full at 3,200 seats, and to watch the pageantry as well as the high content of that. So to be a part of any enterprise that's moving toward some form of separation, the only way in which I said yes to being a part of the process let alone signing off on anything along with 15 other colleagues, and I know this is true for Bishop Easterling, was when there was a presumption that there would be a continuing post-General Conference United Methodist Church, i.e. yet to be perfected, however, yet to be perfected. Second thing is, I look at the investment that other people made in United Methodism and the somewhat circuitous, connective way in which we got onto Ken Feinberg's screen, and this is the power of connection. So, Bishop Bickerton reached out to some folks, including other bishops and other laypersons in the United Methodist Church. Do you know anybody that can help us? And the Feinberg name kept coming up because of his vita, and ultimately we got onto his screen because the chancellor of the Northern Illinois Conference has done work with him at mediating big-time settlements, and you've read about all of that. So here's the thought that I had as we looked at the resources of the Kirkland and Ellis law firm, of which that chancellor is a part, all provided to us without cost. We looked. Mr. Feinberg said, "You'll not ever get one receipt from me, not for a cup of coffee in the airport." So all of his services were donated. So here's the thought. What does it mean to a dispirited people, that would be United Methodists and all of our subsets, when other people, some of whom are not Christian, doesn't mean they're not people of faith and goodwill, believe in you and your future more than you believe in it? Mr. Feinberg is a Jewish brother, an active and I understand attentive Jew, and for which we rejoice because he gets squabbles in faith communities. But for him and his stature, just of his skill set, to actually believe in us, and he said yes to this, and this is nearly a quote. He said, "I believe that healthy, religious, faith-based institutions, emphasis on healthy, add value to society." And he said, I would contend that worldwide. He said, secondly, as I've looked at the record and the history of Methodism and United Methodism in its iterations, while you, of course, are not perfect yet, you have added value to society. It doesn't mean there are no failings, no Achilles heels, no isms. That he never tried to sanitize us. But he said, I believe in the long arc of history, you've added a lot of value. And therefore, I want to see whatever it is you need to do next, that you do it well, so that you can be healthy and continue to add value in all of the places, and that would be globally, where you are as United Methodism. So I ask of you, what does it mean when other people believe in you and your future more than you believe in it yourself? You used the word heavy, we were cumbered with a load of care coming out of St. Louis. And frankly, that load of care has been there for 50 years. For 50 years. We've been burdened down. We have been in chains of multiple kinds around multiple isms. And so I really do see that other people who did not have a nickel in our dime, as it were, as United Methodists, invested in us because they believe that United Methodists, all of our pieces and parts, have the potential and have, in our best moments, added value to the lives of individuals, of nations, and of communities. I mean, you just had to listen yesterday to what all of us have heard repeatedly, and I never tire of Jim Sally's litany about the naysayers for Africa University. And when he comes to a crescendo, in response, a historical, contemporaneous crescendo that says to the naysayers, that says you'll never build a single building, never graduate a single graduate, it'll be like throwing money down a rat hole. I mean, he swells up and I swell up. Because I know in our best moments, United Methodists and all of the predecessor bodies, we have in our best moments. We've got some shameful moments, but in our best moments, we've added value, transformative value to the lives of individuals, communities, and nations. And I want to see that multiplied. And that's why I was willing to invest some of my time, resources, and energy, even tear-stained as I was, in this, to say, how can we make more of that happen, work that transforms nations and continents. So I think that's the only thing I would say as a response as a participant.
Thank you, thank you. I will ask the bishops that want to respond to the question how the protocol will impact the Black church and people of color. How will the protocol, if it is passed in its current form, impact the Black church?
I think it's an opportunity for us to actually invest in renewal of the church. Historically, we have never been ones who have left. And I think if people look at this as an opportunity or an invitation for Black folks to lead the United Methodist Church, I'm using the words of Malcolm X now, I think we might be subject to being bamboozled and hoodwinked, run amok. So we have never been those who have been quick. In fact, we have never left. But when we stay with a purpose to bring change and renewal. So the protocol, I look at it as, I always look for the good news amidst the news. If it brings an end to decades-old conflict and waste of money and energy and efforts and distraction from more important work or just as important work, then it is a good thing. It's an entree into a new future in which we should be helping to shape.
So a couple of quick things in response to the question about effects on us and work that we need to do. We've already said in multiple places that no piece of legislation goes forward where it does not get critiqued. It ought to be critiqued. The protocol ought to be critiqued, but it ought not be more than anything else critiqued without coming to a conclusion. That's not telling you how to vote. Listen to the words very carefully. That's why I want it taped. But it must not be critiqued endlessly without reaching a conclusion. That is true of all of the other pieces of legislation. So it either gets voted up or down, amended, of course, perfected as the case may be. But the key is let's reach a conclusion on this matter that has had us in deep bondage for now roughly 50 years. And so that's the point I want to make. So it's not the lack of critique. I hope we will be people all over the church, not just Ebony people, will be organizing to bring it to perfection, but not as a form of filibuster, because there are people at the General Conference who are astute at using even the amendment process, et cetera, and speeches to filibuster because they don't want a conclusion to be reached. And we need to be really careful, even as we're being wooed into other partnerships, to make sure that they are not a form of filibuster. So those of you that are delegates, be as wise as serpents and as harmless or innocent as doves. Here's the third thing about the Ebony Church, but it's not untrue for others. Even prior to 2016 in Portland, let alone in 2019, people of every hue in the main said from the pew, Whatever you do, bishops, Way Forward Commission, etc., don't make us vote in the local church. Now, in this protocol, you will see options for voting, but there is not one individual, not one annual conference, not one jurisdiction, etc., that is being forced to vote. In fact, you really, in the main, you really only have to express a sentiment in a vote if you want to be somewhere other than the post-general conference UMC. And that's the means have been set up. So that, I think African American churches, or those that have such a large constituency, need to keep that in mind, and we need to keep beating that drum and reiterating it, that no one has to vote and no one has to leave. The vision and the dream of a post-general conference UMC, Bishop Easterling has already said there have to be certain things that happen in certain order, but she's giving you the vision, the dream, and the aspiration. Very much looks like it could become, if we work at it, what the one church plan offered to the church, imperfect as it may have been. I want to say to those in this tribe, of which I'm a part, that is in many regards how African American congregations have functioned historically, with this notable exception. We got to stop shaming people around their sexuality and having people ducking and hiding. Are you hearing me? And playing, it's time, and playing the stereotype game around music and the arts and etc. Either we're a whole body and where we can all exercise our gifts, artistic, can't dance, can't play, etc., where no venue of service in the body is the presumed prerogative of any particular demographic. So whether it's male, female, gay, straight, pigment, etc. Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me? Yeah. So a presumed prerogative around brown paper bag churches.
Come on. Tell it.
Yeah. So now I know y'all don't want to hear that, but we're still struggling with that mess in our tribe. In our tribe. So I feel an unction I should stop right now. Yeah.
That unction of the Spirit. Amen.
I would like to, I would like to offer this. It has already been said that the amount of the 39 million is the floor and not the ceiling. I do think that the impact of the protocol upon the Black church, what it does do for us is protect the interests for the sustainability of the Black church. And I say that to say that what that $39 million number represents is when you look at the budget for the next quad for Africa University and for our ethnic plans, that 39 million really is the amount for that amount over 8 years. Yeah, and so that is important to hear. It's the floor, not the ceiling. But what that does do is give us the space and time necessary for the Reformation to take place. And so that is something that we need to keep in mind. It's not a perfect number, and doesn't mean that we can't ask for more, but it does protect the interest of and for the sustainability of resourcing the Black church. I also need to say this, and I've been taught this since I was a child, that you don't always put all of your eggs in one basket.
All right.
And so while there's a lot of energy and momentum around the protocol, and my hope and prayer is personally that does become the primary enabling legislation that's before the body. However, if it does not, just like we went February 2019 with a great hope of what their recommendation was that came out of the Council of Bishops for that one church plan, I think we need to be having some conversations and strategy also around if it does not, then what? Because there are a lot of plans out there, and what is distinguishing from the other plans to this plan, this allows for a separation, but still for a United Methodist Church to exist. Yes. Those other plans that are out there are for dissolution. Right. So we need to be having some conversation to say, if this does not become the primary legislation, what is our strategy and what is our plan, and what do we need to get around just in case? So I think we need to expand our conversation beyond the protocol.
I'm going to ask Bishop Trimble first, and then Bishop Palmer had one more thing to say, and then we'll go to you, Bishop Easterling.
This was not about the protocol. Are we going to have an opportunity for the
can I
final
just jump in here?
comments?
Yes, we
later?
are going to have opportunities for the
Right on
final.
the
Then this
heels
is
of
not
what my
about the
sister
protocol.
Okay.
just said.
All right.
Which is one of the things, when several of us were in various conversations, even before the protocol team was established, and I won't walk through the history, we don't have time for a history lesson, but you look back across history, whether it's the history of countries, nations, judicatories, churches, every time something is completely dissolved, the groups that have had to fight for their seat at the table always end up at the back again. So that is one of my reasons for resisting some of the legislation that calls for complete dissolution, because all of those gains that have been made over time, as he said, tear-drenched and blood-stained, all that ground is often lost, and you start again at ground zero. So again, I just want to keep that before us as well.
Mine is simply a shout out of love and appreciation and admiration. This happens to be making use of the resource of Ebony Bishops, but there were a lot of people at the table. But I want to say Dr. Junius Dotson, General Secretary and CEO of Discipleship Ministries, was from the beginning of this process a key player, a pivot player, and a huge thought and strategy partner. And so while he's not at this table this morning, where is Dr. Dotson? Is he in the house? Stand up, give him some love today. Yeah. Without Dr. Dotson, in some way, there were moments in which, because of the sequencing and scheduling of meetings, that Bishop Easterling and I would have been completely lost. And so, Junius, thank you, and for your continuing labors as you move around the church, helping to interpret what the protocol is and isn't. And when you have a chance, make sure you express your appreciation for his level of engagement.
Amen. We have been blessed at all levels of the church. All right, we're going to take 2 questions. Reverend Tillett, you know I love you. Questions for information, not preaching or sharing an opinion. All right, we'll get.
Good morning. This will not come as a surprise to Bishop Easterling, but I wanted to present it to the Ebony Bishops and for the group. One of the aspects of the traditionalist plan, WCA, et cetera, inviting folks to come under their tent, is that the trust clause will be eliminated. So therefore, folks, if you come with us, your buildings will belong to you. That is not right now, currently, an aspect of the protocol plan with respect to what I call UMC 2.0. I would suggest that if
What's your question, Pastor?
the question is, can you change that aspect of the protocol plan such that the trust clause goes away for folks that you hope and want to stay in UMC 2.0? Because that might be a determining factor as to whether they stay UMC or they go traditionalist or set up their own thing.
Thank you for the question.
So I will say that when you talk about the WCA stating that in their stream of Methodism, you'll own your own property, again, that is what they worked on prior to coming to the table of the protocol, right? So again, when I talked about work that the different streams need to do, that's their work, this question will be quite, I think, appropriate and relevant as we move into and begin forming the post-separation United Methodist Church. But that was not something that was birthed out of the protocol work or the then attendant legislation, those were decisions that they were already making and how they were going to form their life together moving forward as the WCA. So that's my first response to you, is that question, I think, is appropriate as we move into Methodism 2.0 or UMC 2.0 as you coin it.
Yes, take this question.
Dewan Bowie, East Ohio Conference. This is a generational question. What is a brown bag church? That was a sarcastic question, but because I learned from my brother here what that actually was, so thank you for translation, because I had no idea what that was. Well, yeah, I know, he told me. But a serious question, though. As I have talked to my millennial brothers and sisters that are center-right and center-left, many of us are wondering, okay, the traditionalists are getting a whole new denomination. It seems the progressives are getting the language taken out that they want to be taken out of the Book of Discipline. Where is the space for the centrists? Because it seems to me that traditionalists, progressives, I wouldn't say got what they wanted, but kind of got a denomination, and if there wants to be another denomination, you get like $2 million. So the question is, where is the place for centrists in all of this? It seems like the left and the right are getting what they want, but the center is seems to be left out, if that makes sense.
So we'll invite someone from the panel to respond, and let me be clear, the post-General Conference United Methodist Church will be a place for traditionalists, centrists, and progressives.
That's right. The language that we have used consistently, and you heard it in the press conference that was held in Tampa, is that Methodism, again, when it's at its best, has always been a big tent. Has always. We have not been a narrow doctrinal body. And and Bishop Palmer also used the language of the one church plan. This really is, it will help us create that one church plan, United Methodist Church, where everyone is welcome, everyone is equal, and everyone can live in a context that will allow them to bring their best selves to making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So there is absolutely place and room for centrists, leaning center but right or left, to be present, to be fully at the table, and to live out their lives in this judicatory. Absolutely.
So the new denomination that may be formed is not for traditionalists. It is for people who are traditionalists and do not see themselves in the denomination with anyone else other than other traditionalists. All right, we'll take one more question, my sister, and then we'll wrap it up.
Just a question, Beverly Wilkes Knoll, Eleanor Great Rivers Conference. A question in reference to the money that's designated to go with the new denomination, the $25 million. Is there any consideration given as those churches make access to that $25 million or whatever it is? Is there any consideration given that many of those churches may have stopped giving 100% of their apportionments from 2016 through 2020? And will there be accountability before they can draw on the 25? Bishop Palmer is itching, so it must be.
Yeah. Yes, there is. And when you read I don't want to say the fine print, but in the document, there is a statement about a presumption that whether or not a local church intends to leave, that they are United Methodists and will have good connectional practices until they leave. Now, obviously, everything's an aspiration, including churches paying their apportionments that don't have aught with the denomination. So that was explicitly put in. It was fought for by Bishop Easterling, by Dr. Dotson, myself. I don't want to say we're the only ones as if it was only, but it was really important for us to say, you're in until you're not. And don't try to squirrel your money away to simply pay some back apportionments or your pension obligation as you leave. Be a full participant now, or have this is me speaking in the now, have the moral courage to leave now or attempt to leave now and go on about your business. And but if you're in, you're in. And right now, imperfect as we are all in, and that's an expectation, not just because we're bureaucrats that we have, but it's a way of our saying, we receive resources from the church, mostly through our annual conferences and districts, but the denomination, and therefore we ought to continue to participate. I mean, superintendents are still going out and meeting with every church, no matter for charge conference, et cetera, no matter how contrary they are. Connectional ministry staffs in annual conferences are going out and resourcing. I do not make my decisions about which local churches to preach at on Sunday morning for their 150th anniversary or whatever the occasion, based upon their theology, their size, or their ideology. I intend, and I expect every United Methodist, but this is particularly around clergy, my criteria is, am I a good shepherd? And I may fail at times, but I want somebody to testify that he aspired and leaned in to being a good shepherd. And a good shepherd doesn't treat the sheep like that. And so you're in until you're not, and therefore the system has a right to expect your participation. And I hope that you can mostly you all have to make that known in your annual conferences. And the whole matter of withholding, by the way, post St. Louis, it was not just on the conservative end. And so all of our annual conferences suffered some setback in 19 on apportionments because of churches that were more tended more toward being more fully inclusive, wanted to speak with their money. Finally, let me say this. All of the churches that withhold make a claim that they're escrowing it. Did you hear the word make a claim? Make a claim. And you as colleagues in the annual conference, let alone the system, you got a right to inquire of your colleagues. Show the bank statement, show the finance committee report that this money truly has been set aside for apportionments till your nose is back in joint where you'd like it to be.
Amen, amen. I'll just very quickly, two things. Often people look at bishops and say, will you speak to this? What are you going to do about? Colleagues have influence and power as well. So I agree. When you're back in your annual conferences, you need to put appropriate inquiry upon your colleagues to say, why are you doing this? What are you doing? And do you realize that you are critically hurting and affecting the mission and ministry of this conference and the United Methodist Church? So that's work all of us can do together. The last thing I'll say is we have to be careful the tactics we employ in a particular situation where we're on one side of an argument. Because once these tactics become a part of our toolbox, it's hard to bring it back in. So once we begin weaponizing stewardship because we don't like something in one category, it's hard to then tell your membership, well, we're not going to weaponize stewardship against this. If we teach them, on any issue, that this is how we treat the resources that God has given us and our discipleship, you can't draw that back. So I just, again, caution us to be careful.
Thank you, bishops. Now, we have 20 minutes left, bishops. Oh, good. And I'm going to invite each of you to offer a word to the Black church. This is your opportunity to offer a word to the Black church, and Bishop Trumbull wants to go first. So we will allow him to do that.
I will not take the 20 minutes either.
Well, 20 minutes among all of you.
I know it.
Collectively.
Divided by 6.
Not 20 minutes apiece.
Let me be clear. Thank you.
All right.
Get us
I
in
think
line,
we would be
Bishop.
remiss at this 53rd meeting of National BMCR not to remember that we're standing on the shoulders of those who've gone before us. Since we last gathered, we have lost some giants. I'm going to tie this into what I call an unclaimed blessing, and I'm going to make reference in less than 3 minutes to several people, including Reverend Dr. Yvette Massey, and I was at Bible study, and I'm coming for part 2 tomorrow as well. An unclaimed blessing. October 1st, 2019, we lost one of the giants of biblical scholarship, Old Testament, New Testament, biblical languages. And you cannot write the history of National BMCR without mentioning this name, the Reverend Dr. Kane Hope Felder. And some of you don't know that name, do the research. Some of you who were here and walked alongside of him need to help continue to teach that. I mention his name because in the original African Heritage Bible, which was published in 1993, early on, there's a subtitle in the beginning of unclaimed blessing. The church is at its best when we recognize the gift of Africa and African American religious experience. Amen? And at the core of that gift from Africa and from a true, as Dr. Felder would say, a true understanding of the African presence in the Bible has been the affirmation of the celebration of life. So United Methodist Church is at its best when we celebrate life and the gift of the African and African American contribution both to the biblical and the narrative story of Methodism throughout the globe. Amen, lights? And so I would not want this meeting to come to a conclusion. I hope this is being recorded because I want the name of the Reverend Dr. Kane Hope Felder to be in the records of the 53rd annual meeting of National BMCR. The Bible is multiracial and multicultural, with its purpose being a universalism of the salvation story. We are bishops of the whole church. We're Ebony bishops, but we're bishops of the whole church. So when I was preaching last year in Sierra Leone, Latrell, I was a bishop of the church. When I was in Iowa, and my wife and I, we used to have sightings when we would go to the grocery store. Come on, somebody. Where's Jackie? Is Jackie here? We had sightings. So whenever we saw black folks, we said, hey! Hey! Come on, somebody. Come on, Greg. You know what I'm talking about. Yes. So we are bishops of the whole church. Come on. If you superintendents out there, you superintendents of the whole church.
That's right.
Racism releases the spirit of death from one culture to another. It's not good enough for us to be an inclusive church. I don't even like the term tolerant. Mm-hmm. We need to move to be an anti-racist church.
Yes. If you don't have that,
and a prophetic church in action, not just in word. That's right, Ibram X. Kendi.
Yes, sir.
I recommend the book,
Yes, please.
How to Be an Anti-Racist. Get the book. Give it to your friend. We are what we see ourselves as. When it comes to healing America, and I'm borrowing from Ibram X here. When it comes to healing America, and I would say to healing the church of racism, see, our problem is we want to heal America without pain.
Yes.
But without pain, there is no progress. So the next chapter, I believe, is going to be maybe just as painful as this chapter. But God is a God of deliverance. And so I just want to encourage us that this is an unclaimed blessing. Let me paraphrase what I got out of Bible study this morning from Reverend Yvette Massey. It is never the wrong time to do the right thing. Did that cover it? I was there. You can tell I was there now. I was in the back. I want to get credit for attendance. It's never the wrong time. It's never the wrong time to do the right thing. And I'm going to stop talking right there. Amen. Glory to God.
Who will be next? Bishop King, you've been awfully silent, and we would love to have the wisdom of one of our retired bishops.
Well, I wanted to remain silent, quiet, but I will want to say a few things. And the first is a word of gratitude to you all as bishops, especially the active bishops who are out there on the line every day. Thank you so much for the fight. for making a difference. And I'd like to lift up my brother John Scholl, who is so faithful to BMCR.
Amen.
And for
Amen.
your commitment. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm grateful to you and your presence here and your commitment that just didn't start today in making a difference in this world. Thank you so much for your love of God through Jesus Christ to make this world a better place. I would add, stay woke. Stay woke. Structural life is extremely important. If it's not in an organization, it will develop as a means of doing the work of those who believe. But structure will not replace your commitment to do the work on the ground in making disciples of Jesus Christ. So when the structures have been adjusted, at this point, there are still too many predominantly African American congregations that you can throw a bowling ball through the sanctuary and not touch anyone. Now, I used to say to my cabinet, I don't have time to cry about it. But when the structures have been adjusted, will you go deeper than the shout into the formation that makes disciples of Jesus Christ to change the world in which we live? Lastly, I would ask any person who says they know Jesus and that they love Jesus, that means you love me. And if they can't say, as a disciple, as a Christian, they love me, the judgment is not on me or on them. The judgment speaks for itself. Thank you.
Amen. My Lord Bishop. My understanding is that from 1766, when Methodism came to America, we were present. Black people were present before Methodism was even officially formed.
That is correct.
And so my commitment, and I know our commitment is, we're not going anywhere. It's our church. It's our church. The reality, however, is, let me say it this way. I was on renewal leave, and I was in my boat, which is called prayer. I spend a lot of time in prayer.
Somebody call you.
And I was anchored down. I was anchored down, and I spider rigged fish, which means I had about 8 rods out. I was anchored down. I walked to the back of the boat to check one of my rods, and I was ankle deep in water in the back of my boat. That was a problem because I was 8 miles away from the dock. I was sitting about a mile away from shore, but the shore that I was closest to was in alligator-infested water. And so that became a problem.
That's a situation, man.
I had a hole in my boat.
Hole in my boat?
Now, there's some things that you can do if you have a hole in your boat, if you know what you're doing. The first thing you have to do is you have to make sure you have your life jacket on. Now, I'm not just talking about fishing now. In the Methodist church, in the black church, we got a hole in the boat. The first thing is to make sure you got your life jacket on. The second thing you got to do is you got to get your equipment and your anchors up real quick because you can't be slowed down. So I got all that stuff in, and the next thing you have to do is you got to start the motor while the motor can still start, because if the water is filling up the battery containment, and you're not going to have a spark because it's going to be wet. You hear me? So I got the motor started, and then I was able to start moving forward even though the boat was filling up with water. Centrifugal force if you get moving. will force the water out the back end of your boat. And you can gain momentum and speed. But you got to be moving. The next thing I did was got on my cell phone and I called ahead and said, I'm coming in hot. Would somebody look under the floor mat of my car and back my trailer down because I don't have time to stop? I was able to get the boat in, and I was able to get it repaired, not so I could say I got a pretty boat that's repaired, but so I could get back to the business that I wanted to do, and that was to catch fish.
Say so. Say so.
We've got a hole in the boat.
Hole in the boat.
But it's not hopeless. It's not hopeless. The boat can be repaired. And we can continue about the business of catching men and women and boys and girls for Jesus Christ.
Amen. Crank that engine up. Amen.
Centrifugal force.
I want to give back my time because all of these colleagues in the House has been generous, and I would only add one sentence to what Bishop Trimble said, that the Reverend Dr. Kane Hope Felder was the first executive director of this organization, 53 years or so, or just after the 53 years. So that's just information.
Thank you.
I yield the balance of my time.
This is a smart man. This is a smart man. He knows what to do. Amen. Because I don't want to follow that. But beloved, smart man. Smart man. Beloved, so quickly. We often call for prophecy. We often call for prophetic witness, prophetic preaching, prophetic messaging. But they kill the prophets because the prophets say things that are hard for all of us to hear and that wake us up in ways that we'd rather not be awakened. And so there's so much that is a blessing and positive about the black church that has been there since the very beginning and has contributed to everything that is good and honorable and godly about the Methodist Church in all of its iterations. And there are challenges that face the black church. And not all of those challenges come from without. Some of them do come from within. So we know that we have brilliance in the Methodist Church, in the black church, and it isn't just about the singing and the clapping and the shouting and the good preaching that we offer. That's there, but that's not the whole. There's brilliance. There are strategic minds. Again, like Junius Dotson and others that have been pivotal in leading us at different times in this church. And there's some folk that are lazy. There's some folks that hide behind racism because they don't want to put their elbow to the grind and do the hard work of ministry. And so part of our prophetic witness needs to be to not allow persons who are weighing down the boat to find safe quarter behind some of the legitimate things that we do need to be talking about. And we need to, at home, right? They say start at home. We need to, at home, call out and identify those persons who are not living up to the dignity, the privilege, and the opportunity that is given to us. Rehabilitate where we can, and then some folk we need to say, and now you've invited yourself to a new opportunity, and that's okay too. So as we move forward, again, not denying that racism and some other systemic things are problems for us, and we will address those. But let's not hide behind things and not be who God has called us to be, the best of ourselves, as we move this denomination forward. Amen.
Like many of you, I've given my life in full service to this church. And the work that we're doing and the dreaming that we're doing, don't we know that it's not just about us? I have a 21-year-old daughter, I have a 17-year-old daughter. The work that we're doing and the decisions that we make, or the lack thereof, the question becomes, what kind of church? Not just the church that we're dreaming or imagining, but what would the church look like, and what would be the gift of the church to generations to come? I'm reminded of the book of Numbers, when Moses sent out the 12 spies to the land of Canaan. And they were to spend time there surveying the land. And when the report came back in, many of them came back with a report saying that while the land is flowing with milk and honey, while fruit is being produced, or the ground is fertile for fruit to be produced, but they're like giants, and we're like grasshoppers. But thanks be to God that Caleb had a different kind of report. He spent the same amount of time in the same land, but he came back and quieted everybody down to say, yeah, the land is flowing with milk and honey, and the ground is fertile for fruit, and we can go in and we can conquer it. It is my hope and my prayer that BMCR, that we will be the Calebs, that we would be the restorers of the breach, that we would be the ones to help reimagine the church, of what the church could be like, what the church can look like, not just for the preservation of the church, not just for the preservation of our positions within the life of the church, but because of who the United Methodist Church is and who we say we are as a people of faith. My prayer is that we don't give up, that we don't give in, that we don't run, but that we do what God has called each of us to do, and that is the faithful work of discipleship and witness, but also to the faithful work of reimagining a church. But you can't reimagine it if you're not there. So my prayer is that we don't leave, but my prayer is that we stay, and that we dream of a church, of what the church could be like, where all of God's children of every hue and color, of every orientation, of every ideology and theology, can live together and be faithful to the mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world.
Amen. In the 30 seconds that I have left, let me give honor where honor is due. Bishop John Scholl commissioned me and ordained me. And after I had been ordained for 3 years, invited me to be a part of his cabinet as a district superintendent. When he called me to make that offer, I said to him, Bishop, you are crazy. I say to you, BMCR, it's time to go crazy. Amen.